Elon Musk's big plan? All social media is a lie. That's the truth. This was never supposed to be a story, yet it became the kind of story that quietly grows in the background while the world scrolls past it without realizing how close it is to the truth. It is not a movie scene, it is not fiction, and it is not a theory whispered in dark corners of the internet. It is something far more uncomfortable, because it is real and it is happening in plain sight, while most people are too distracted to notice. It started with a sentence, not a speech, not a threat, not a declaration of war, just a sentence spoken calmly by a man. Most people think they already understand Elon Musk, but the moment those words left his mouth, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply like a fault line moving beneath the surface of the digital world. Journalists reacted before the sentence, even Finnish politicians responded without being named. Social media accounts vanished, reappeared, and vanished again. And millions of ordinary users felt something they could not explain, a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief, because someone had finally said what many suspected. Fear, because once said it could not be unheard. This was not about cars or rockets or billionaires. This was about who decides what is real, who decides what is allowed to exist, and who gets erased without a sound. For years, people believed they were free online. They believed their opinions were their own, their feeds were neutral, and their voices mattered. But what if that belief was carefully curated? What if freedom was not taken away violently but filtered silently? What if control no longer looked like force, but like convenience, comfort, and safety? This is where the story truly begins, not with Elon Musk, but with the system. He pointed at a system so powerful that most people never even see it working. It does not knock on doors. It does not wear uniforms. It does not make demands. Instead, it quietly decides what you see first, what you never see at all, and what disappears before you even realize it existed. And when Musk spoke about free speech, it was not the word speech that terrified powerful institutions. It was the word free, because freedom in an algorithmic world is unpredictable, uncontrollable, and dangerous to those who profit from order and narrative discipline. Within minutes, headlines appeared framing the moment as reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous, yet none of them addressed the core question he raised. Instead, they attacked the man, questioned his motives, his character, his intelligence, because it is always easier to discredit the messenger than confront the message, especially when the message threatens an entire ecosystem built on silent agreement. For decades, Twitter was described as just an app, just a website, just a place to post opinions, but that description was a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. Twitter became the place where reality was tested before being released to the public, where journalists floated stories before printing them, where politicians measured reactions before committing, and where movements were either amplified or buried long before the world noticed. If Facebook was the living room, Twitter was the control room, and control rooms are never neutral. They decide what lights stay on and which ones go dark. When Musk bought Twitter, the panic was immediate, and revealing companies froze, advertising governments issued statements, media outlets warned of chaos, and behind closed doors, conversations turned urgent, because this was not about one billionaire owning a platform. This was about losing predictability, losing narrative stability, losing the ability to quietly guide public perception without resistance. And then came the moment, the sentence, the one replayed millions of times, stripped of context, framed as dangerous, yet never fully addressed, because addressing it honestly would require admitting something most institutions avoid at all costs: that social media platforms had become the most powerful political actors of the modern age. Without elections, without accountability, and without transparency, Musk did not claim to be a savior. He did not promise perfection. He simply exposed the uncomfortable truth that moderation is not neutral, algorithms are not objective, and silence is not always safety. Sometimes silence is control, and that realization spread faster than any trend because it resonated with personal experience. People remembered posts that vanished, opinions that triggered warnings, accounts that disappeared without explanation, and they began connecting dots that had been scattered for years. This was not about left or right. It was about allowed and forbidden, visible and invisible, acceptable and erased. And once people see that distinction, they cannot unsee it. The anger that followed was not manufactured. It was organic, raw, and deeply human, because no one likes to realize they have been guided without consent. Yet this story does not end here, because the real power of this moment was not in what Musk said, but in what it forced others to reveal. Media responses became defensive, political language grew vague, and institutions that once claimed neutrality suddenly took clear positions, and that contradiction spoke louder than any tweet ever could. If free speech was truly protected, why did the idea of more of it cause such fear? If platforms were neutral, why did transparency feel like a threat? And if users were safe, why did open discussion feel dangerous? These questions lingered unanswered, hanging over every headline, every debate, and every carefully worded statement. And this is where the story becomes larger than one man, larger than one platform, and larger than one moment. because what Musk touched was a nerve that runs through the entire digital world, a world where information is currency, attention is power, and silence is profit. And the uncomfortable truth is this: once speech is filtered, reality follows, and once reality is filtered, freedom becomes an illusion wrapped in convenience. And this realization did not come all at once. It came slowly, quietly, spreading through comment sections, podcasts, late-night conversations, and private messages, until a new awareness began forming, one that could not be easily dismissed, mocked, or censored, because it was rooted in lived experience. People did not need statistics to know something felt wrong. They felt it every time they hesitated before posting, every time they softened their words, every time they wondered if saying the wrong thing would cost them visibility, opportunity, or community. And that is the most powerful form of control, the kind that convinces people to censor themselves. And once that happens, no authority needs to intervene. The system runs itself smoothly, efficiently, and silently. And that is why this story matters, because it is not about Elon Musk. It is about you, the screen in your hand, the feed you scroll, and the invisible decisions shaping your perception of the world. And in the next part of this story, we will look at how governments quietly adapted to this system, how media credibility began to fracture, and why this moment marked the beginning of a global shift that cannot be reversed, only accelerated. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not announce itself with sirens or breaking news banners. Instead, it unfolded quietly behind policy updates, vague statements, and subtle changes in tone. Governments around the world began to understand something crucial: control over information no longer required direct censorship laws or visible crackdowns. It required influence over platforms, narratives, and acceptable boundaries of discussion. Once those boundaries were set, the rest happened. Naturally, journalists adjusted language, politicians avoided certain phrases, and users learned through experience which opinions traveled far and which ones vanished without explanation. This was not coordination in the traditional sense. It was alignment, an unspoken agreement shaped by incentives, fear, and access. And when Elon Musk disrupted that alignment, he did not break the system. He exposed it. Governments that once relied on press conferences and official channels now depended on digital platforms to shape public perception. Crises were no longer managed only through policy, but through visibility: what trended, what disappeared, and what was framed as dangerous misinformation rather than inconvenient truth. And when a single platform shifted its philosophy, even slightly, it threatened that delicate balance. Reactions followed predictable patterns. Officials spoke about responsibility, safety, and stability, rarely defining those terms clearly, because clarity would reveal control. Media outlets framed the discussion as chaos versus order, ignoring the possibility that order itself had become the problem. Credibility, which once came from trust, now depended on alignment with accepted narratives, and as a result, journalism began to fracture. Audiences noticed inconsistencies, selective outrage, and sudden reversals in tone. Stories that were dismissed one year became undeniable the next, without apology or accountability. And that erosion of trust did not start with Musk, but his actions accelerated it, because he removed the illusion of consensus by allowing disagreement to surface openly. Disagreement is messy, uncomfortable, and loud, but it is also honest, and honesty is dangerous to systems built on controlled agreement. Critics argued that opening the gates would unleash misinformation, hate, and instability, and they were not entirely wrong. But the deeper question remained: who gets to decide what risk is acceptable and who bears the cost of those decisions? Because when speech is restricted, the harm is immediate and invisible. But when speech is free, the harm is visible, chaotic, and shared. Society has always struggled with this balance, but never at this scale, never with algorithms capable of shaping billions of minds simultaneously. The digital world amplified everything: truth, lies, fear, anger, hope, and outrage. And those amplifications became tools, not neutral features. Algorithms learned what kept people engaged, not informed, and engagement rewarded emotion over accuracy, outrage over nuance, and certainty over doubt. This created a feedback loop where the most extreme interpretations traveled fastest, and moderation became less about truth and more about damage control. Within this environment, governments did not need to issue orders. Platforms anticipated expectations, media adapted language, and users self-filtered to avoid social and professional consequences. The result was a digital ecosystem that appeared free but operated within narrow, invisible boundaries. And when those boundaries were challenged, the reaction was swift, because the system was not designed to defend itself publicly. It relied on quiet compliance. And when Musk questioned that silence, he forced offenders into the open, revealing contradictions that had long been hidden. Claims of neutrality collided with clear preferences. Claims of safety clashed with selective enforcement. And claims of democracy felt hollow when unelected. Systems shape public discourse more than voters ever could. This was not a conspiracy. It was an evolution, a natural outcome of technology, scaling faster than ethics regulation and public understanding, and the consequences were unavoidable. Trust eroded, polarization increased, and every disagreement felt existential. Because when people cannot agree on reality, compromise becomes impossible. The Musk moment did not create these problems, but it acted as a mirror reflecting them back to society, unfiltered, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. In that reflection forced individuals to choose not sides, but awareness of how much of their worldview was influenced by unseen systems, awareness of how often they accepted conclusions without questioning the process, and awareness of how easily freedom can be traded for convenience. When the cost feels abstract, this awareness spread unevenly. Some embraced it, others rejected it. Many felt overwhelmed because questioning information systems requires effort, humility, and uncertainty is exhausting. It is far easier to accept curated reality than confront complexity, but complexity does not disappear. When ignored, it accumulates pressure beneath the surface, and pressure eventually demands release. That release came in many forms: long-form conversations, independent media, alternative platforms, and renewed interest in free speech. Principles once considered settled. The debate evolved beyond one man, one platform, and one statement. It became a global conversation about power, legitimacy, and the future of communication itself. And here lies the most unsettling realization: control over speech does not guarantee truth. It only guarantees order, and order without truth is fragile, because it cannot adapt to reality. When reality changes, it breaks violently. History offers countless examples. Societies that silenced dissent did not eliminate problems, they delayed them until collapse. The digital age simply accelerated this dynamic, compressing decades of tension into years and months. And as more people recognized this pattern, the conversation shifted from personalities to principles, from outrage to structure, from what was said to why the reaction mattered. And that shift marked a turning point, because once people question the system itself, no single actor can fully contain the debate. Not governments, not media, and not platforms. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle. Awareness, once gained, spreads quietly, persistently, and irreversibly. And in the final part of this story, we will explore what comes next, how this awareness changes politics, media, and individual responsibility, and why the future of free speech will not be decided by one platform or one billionaire, but by whether society chooses comfort or truth, control or openness and silence, or the risk of honest conversation. What comes next is not a prediction, but a consequence, because systems do not change when exposed. They change when people alter their behavior. And that change is already happening quietly across the world. Individuals no longer rely on a single source. They compare narratives, they question framing, and they notice what is missing as much as what is shown. This does not make everyone informed, but it makes them suspicious, and suspicion is the beginning of independence. Politics is already adapting. Speeches are crafted for multiple reality statements, are designed to trend differently on different platforms, and ambiguity becomes a survival strategy. Leaders speak without saying, journalists report without concluding, and institutions move carefully, aware that credibility, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through authority alone. This creates a strange paradox. The more information becomes available, the harder it becomes to control interpretation, and that loss of control frightens systems built on predictability, because predictability is power. In an uncertain world, media faces the same reckoning. Audiences fragment, trust becomes conditional, and loyalty shifts from institutions to individuals. Voices that feel authentic gain influence, while polished narratives feel hollow. And this does not mean truth automatically rises. It means competition for truth intensifies, and in that competition, clarity, humility, and transparency matter more than volume. Outrage or access algorithms struggle in this environment because they were never designed to reward nuance. They reward reaction. And as long as attention remains the currency, distortion will persist. But awareness changes how distortion is received. People begin to recognize emotional manipulation. They pause before sharing. They ask who benefits and why. And that pause is revolutionary, because it interrupts automation of outrage, automation of belief, automation of division. This is where responsibility returns to the individual, not as a burden, but as a choice. Free speech is not the absence of consequences. It is the presence of accountability. Accountability to question, to verify, and to tolerate disagreement without demanding silence. The future will not be perfectly free or perfectly controlled. It will be contested, constantly renegotiated through culture, technology, and choice platforms will rise and fall, regulations will shift, and new tools will emerge. But the core question will remain unchanged: who decides and why and whether. Society is willing to accept the discomfort that comes with openness because openness is not safe, it is unpredictable, messy, and demanding, but it is also the only environment where truth can survive. Long-term comfort, on the other hand, is seductive. It offers simplicity, certainty, and relief from responsibility, but it always comes at a cost. That cost is awareness, autonomy, and eventually freedom. This story did not begin with Elon Musk, and it will not end with him. He was a catalyst, not a conclusion. A moment that accelerated a conversation already waiting to happen, and that conversation now belongs to everyone scrolling, watching, listening, and deciding whether to engage passively or consciously. The screen in your hand is not neutral. It reflects choices made by people, systems, and incentives. And once you understand that you're no longer just a user, you are a participant, and participation carries power, the power to question, to resist manipulation, and to demand transparency, not through outrage, but through attention, intention, and thought. Because the most powerful form of freedom is not the ability to say anything, it is the ability to think clearly in a world designed to confuse. And that is where this story ends, not with an answer, but with a responsibility, one that cannot be outsourced, delegated, or silenced. Because once you see the system, you're already part of changing it, whether you choose to or not.